Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Festival of Enterprise webinar series. I'm David Stevenson, your host, and I'm joined this morning by Tom Blake, who is the Global HR Director and Executive Coach from Blake Connolly. Tom, thanks for joining us this morning.
Welcome, thank you.
Tom will be discussing the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, what it is, how to implement it, what employees can and cannot do during furlough, and how to claim the grant and then bring employees back to work. And Tom's going to be taking us through a presentation, and then we'll open the floor up to questions afterwards. So with that, Tom, thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you, David. So if you could go to the next slide straight away, that'd be great, thank you. So hi everybody, as David said, my name is Tom Blake. As well as a Global HR Director and Exec Coach, I'm the Managing Director of Blake Connolly. We're a people performance expertise consultancy, but with coronavirus coming along, our clients wanted us to start focusing on what the furlough scheme is. So we pivoted very quickly to kind of close down or stand down some of our organizational development work and really started to focus on the scheme. So over the last 4.5 weeks since everything has been out in the press, personally, I've been advising my clients. I've been advising around about 10,000 HR professionals. I'm also a commentator and an expert for the CIPD, which is the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, which is HR's focus. So I've become a bit of an expert on furlough, as much as anybody can. Ultimately, this scheme has been around for around about 4.5 weeks now. And as I'm sure you all know, the government keep putting out updates. So we've had 5 updates plus a piece of legislation since the scheme was announced on the 20th of March. So everything I'm going to go through is reflective of the latest updates and changes, which were released at 5:30 on Friday. So I'm going to take you through these 3 particular areas. So who can I furlough and how do you do it? What do you actually need to do? Once your employees are on furlough, what can they do? And then for you as a business, what do you need to do and how do you calculate and claim the grant from HMRC? And then towards the end, we'll look at how you might rehire ex-employees, because obviously that's been in the media a lot, so it's worthwhile just focusing on for a moment. And then we'll look at how and what to claim, and I'll touch on how you also bring employees back from furlough. So if I could have the next slide, please, David. We're just going to jump straight in with an overview. So really the overview talks about what is the scheme. So obviously a lot of people now know what the scheme is, but I thought it's always worthwhile just to take a step back, just so we're all on the same page. So the furlough scheme is designed to protect jobs by enabling companies to temporarily lay people off from their workforce and enabling employers to claim a grant to cover 80% of the salaries, which is capped at £2,500. The scheme originally was going to last for 3 months. However, we had an update last week on Friday to say that it's now been extended for a month. So the scheme will last from the 1st of March till the end of June at the moment. Now, all business types in the UK, so if you have a UK payroll, you are eligible to be part of the scheme. And that does include public authorities. Now, there's a lot of noise around public authorities, what they can and can't do, but they are actually covered under the scheme. So whether you are a business, a charity, recruitment agencies, an umbrella company, etc., all UK payrolls are covered. Then we have our employee types, who's covered, so full-time, part-time, employees on agency contracts, flexible and 0 hours contracts are also covered. Other employees, because there was a clarification on, I think, the 3rd update around individuals who are not quite technically employees, but they are still covered under the scheme as long as they are on a PAYE payroll. So for example, office holders, so company directors, salaried members of LLPs, agency workers as mentioned, and Lim B workers. I'm just going to move straight on to the next slide because I think that's part of what everybody knows. Now, one of the key things is this cut-off date. So when are people actually eligible? So I'll talk about new starters in a second. But again, originally, the scheme talked about being employed on the 28th of February 2020. That has subsequently been updated. And it's been updated in the only way I suppose HMRC could. They've HMRC'd it. They've started to talk about RTI returns. So I'll talk about what an RTI return is in a moment. But the new cut-off date is the 19th of March 2020, which effectively is the day before Rishi Sunak announced the scheme. By the 19th of March, employers needed to have an operational PAYE in operation for their company. They needed to have employees on that PAYE scheme, and they needed to have completed an RTI submission with that employee on it by the 19th of March. So for those that don't know, the RTI is it stands for real-time information, and it's what all companies submit to HMRC on or around payday. Now, it goes on payday primarily because it has to mirror and match the payments that you're making to your employees in terms of their salary. It's a confirmation to HMRC of who is on your payroll, how much you've paid them, and effectively how much tax is owed in that pay period. This is why they're talking about an RTI period. So it's that real live data of that snapshot of that month of who is your employees or who are your employees. But the RTI date is not actually one of the most important dates because there's quite a lot of things that have to happen to get us to an RTI date. And what the picture shows you here is the steps that actually have to be taken before you can get to an RTI date. So actually, for your companies and for your employees, the most important date is actually your payroll cutoff date. So the payroll cutoff date is when you as a business close your payroll and you say, now there are going to be no more changes until we actually pay payroll out. Now, in a lot of companies, that might be 1 week. So you can see on the timeline at the bottom that we've got here, from the 1st of February, I've looked at February and March as a snapshot. So as an example, if the payday was the 28th of February, that would be the day that the RTI submission is paid. It's the date of the RTI submission, and it's also the date that your employees are paid. But in this example, we're saying that payroll actually cuts off on the 21st of February. So your employee would have needed to have been on payroll before cutoff to actually make it onto that submission. So what you need to do, I believe, particularly when you're talking to your new starters, is actually have in mind what your payroll cutoff was, rather than your RTI submission date. Because as you can see here, if somebody started on the 21st of February or after, they wouldn't have made it onto that RTI on the 28th of February, and they wouldn't have been paid in February either. They would have been rolled over onto the 31st of March pay, which means their data would have been submitted after the cutoff. It's one of the key things just for businesses to get your heads around. It's the cutoff date versus a payroll cutoff date. Now, some employees as well, just to help you with some of your employees who might be new starters, who are, obviously there is a lot in the press. We can all debate whether or not there should be a cutoff date. I will come to that at the end. But at the moment, people are starting to blame the process around not getting RTI submissions in. That's an unfair thing. These processes are set. They have been done for years. Employees are starting to think that an RTI should have been sent off the day that they started. It's just not true. Your RTI automatically goes on the day you pay, probably up to about 24 hours beforehand. That's it. So it's not a case that as an employee starts, somebody in your company should have submitted an RTI. It's the RTI goes once a month and it mirrors the pay run. So just keep that in mind as you're talking to your employees. So we talked a little bit about who can be covered. So it's all employees. And the key thing to always bear in mind is that this is a scheme designed when there is no work available as an alternative to redundancy. So David, if I could have the next slide, please. There's a couple of areas that have been clarified as to whether or not you can furlough particular individuals. And the two that I'm going to focus on, which are the two that broadly are hitting most organisations, are shielding and childcare. Now, shielding is when an individual is severely vulnerable, has been given a letter by Public Health England to effectively tell them to remain in their homes. Under shielding, The legislation, so the one bit that people are missing is there is a lot of guidance on HMRC's website and about the scheme and the detail. There is also now a piece of legislation that has also been brought about under the Coronavirus Act. And the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme is a schedule within that act. So this clause 6.1 that you can see actually comes from the legislation. And the reason why you can enable shielders and those with childcare difficulties onto the furlough programme is because you might give an instruction that is given by reason of circumstances arising as a result of coronavirus or coronavirus disease. How that works with shielding, and I think I touch on this in a little bit more detail in a moment, how that works with shielding is that if your work is available on site, the shielder cannot actually leave their home. So it's not their fault that they cannot come to work to undertake that work. They are staying at home under public health guidelines. So you can offer to furlough them. Obviously, if they've got work and they can work from home and they're not sick, you wouldn't place them on furlough. But this particular piece of shielding advice is an exception to the no work rule. Because what you are saying as a company is there is work available, but you can't get here to do it because you're following the right guidelines. The same is also true for childcare. So you may have employees who have childcare issues. Obviously, the vast majority of parents can't send their children to school because the schools are closed because of coronavirus. So again, the reason why they cannot fulfill their duties is because of coronavirus. So the key question to always come back to is the situation because of coronavirus? If it is, and you want to offer furlough, then you just need to create the argument that shows HMRC why the situation has been driven by coronavirus. Another couple of complex areas, if we could move on please, David, is around sickness and self-isolation. So the guidance in itself makes it very, very clear that the retention scheme is not meant to be used for short-term absences. And the reason for this is there is a 3-week minimum period of time. And we also have other mechanisms in the UK to cover for things like sickness. We have statutory sick pay. The rates are obviously very, very different, but there is already a mechanism there. Employers can furlough employees who are currently off sick or self-isolating, but it's at the point that no work becomes available. So the key question is, when did work not be available? So somebody is sick, they phone in sick. There's a few examples on the slide. So for example, your employee John just phones you today, calls in sick with a cough and a cold. You can't just furlough him because he's called in sick. It's currently a short-term absence, so the employee should be covered by either your company sick pay or statutory sick pay. Next example is a little bit longer. So Sally's been off for 3 weeks and covered on SSP, but obviously as the business you can no longer claim at SSP. But you can't actually furlough because it's still not considered long-term sick, and also there is work available. So we're still back into this realm of it's short-term absence does not mean that you can automatically furlough. Sam has been off sick for a week, but now there is no work available. So can you furlough? Yes, you can, because there's no work available. But what you need to do is bring about the end of the period of sickness and then transfer them on to furlough. So ultimately, you start furlough and the day before you would end sick pay. It is quite straightforward once you get your head around the key thing, and the key component is when did the work cease? That becomes the date that you can furlough, and you might have a few things that have been happening beforehand. So I'm going to move on to talk about how to actually operate. So we talked about all the types of people and situations where people can. That's an interesting slide. That's obviously not come up quite well on the PowerPoint, but that's okay. Basically, what this slide talks about is how to effect furlough. So people might have seen in the press and the media things about layoff clauses. The key thing to remember, really, the most important thing is that this is an agreement between you as the employer and the employee. It is not one way. The employer can make a decision that they want to furlough their staff, but then their staff actually have to agree to it. So if you have something called a layoff clause, and just by magic, my slide has appeared, so that's brilliant. You have something called a layoff clause in your contracts. You can actually activate it. You can actually write to your employees and say, we are activating our layoff clause, and this is the reason why, and this is what we are doing. So we are placing you on furlough. This is the dates that we are putting you on furlough, and these are the pay arrangements that we're going to have for you. You still need them to actually sign for it. If you don't have a layoff clause, you technically might need to consult. Now, consultation can be quick because the scheme has enabled businesses to act quite quickly. And again, as it is an agreement, this is where consultation and agreement kind of work together. You can send out a letter with some communications, or however you normally run your company comms, and ask people to go on to furlough. Again, they need to agree to it. Now, if people don't agree, you can also at the same time set out the other options that are available to your staff. So for example, you could have a technical layoff. You could bring that clause in, and there's legislation about what layoff actually means. You could be asking people to take unpaid leave, or effectively you could be saying that they will be made redundant. So you can put those options to your employees and effectively have them choose. Now, the vast majority of people are going to choose furlough because it is a guarantee of wage of 80% up to 2.5K. However, some people might choose redundancy, particularly if they've been there for a long time. This particular presentation isn't going to cover redundancy. That's something slightly different. More than happy to take questions outside of the webinar via the website on redundancy. But the point of this is that there is an option there. Key thing is confirmation is needed in writing, and it is an agreement. And you also need to make sure that you are holding this on file for 5 years. What that basically tells us is this is how long HMRC are going to give themselves to come and audit organisations. So they're not going to come and do it now because everybody's a little bit too busy trying to get through the scheme. But you need to make sure you have your documentation, because they might come knocking in 4 years and 11 months' time to see everything that's happened. They're quite clear that they expect the scheme to be tried to be used for fraud. So the expectation is that they will be auditing quite heavily. So now you've worked out who you can furlough, you've worked out how you can furlough. What can your employees actually do while they are furloughed? So if we can move to the next slide, please, David. So there is a minimum period of 3 weeks that an individual needs to be furloughed for. So if you find that you have furloughed employees and you need to bring them back after 2 weeks, that's fine, you can do that. You just can't claim for the grant for the 2 weeks that they were off work. So the minimum claim period is 3 weeks, and they've set that period of time effectively based on public health guidelines of times around self-isolation. During furlough, employees cannot work for the company, and this has now been broadened to say, or associated company who has furloughed them. So if you have furloughed them, they cannot do any work for you. Employees can take another job with another employer if your contract with them allows them to, and you're happy to do that. That is a conversation to have with your employees, because they still effectively need to be remaining available for work for you. So I'll talk in a moment about bringing people back, because ultimately you could be phoning them up one day and going, right, we need you to return to work tomorrow. If they've got a job with another employer, it is for that individual to think about how they are then going to get out of that contract with that employer to come back to you. Their contract with a third party is none of your business, and I wouldn't make it your business either. All you need to make sure is that your employees understand they need to be available for work for you. Employees can volunteer for anyone. That includes the company who have furloughed them. However, the volunteering cannot either provide a service now or in the future, or generate revenue now or in the future. So for example, keeping in contact with customers via email. No, that's providing a service. You can't do that. Creating some marketing plans for a product that's going to be launched in 12 months' time. No, because that would be seen as generating revenue in the future. If it's things like maintenance isn't technically providing a service or generating revenue. Things like that can be allowed. if you are going to ask your employees to volunteer, the key thing is ask, you cannot require or demand. So you can't make it part of your agreement to say, we will furlough you if you do X, Y, and Z voluntarily. That's not going to cut it with HMRC. You just need to be really clear about the activity you're asking them to do and why it is not a service or does not generate revenue. And finally, employees can take annual leave while furloughed. This has finally been clarified on Friday. So if they do take annual leave, or if you require them to take annual leave, you have to top up their pay to 100%. This also includes bank holidays. So the double bank holiday we've just had, if you have people who are furloughed, you need to top up their salary so that they receive 100% of their pay. Okay.
During the period they're absent, for annual leave only.
Correct, yes. So on annual leave days, including bank holidays, you top up their pay because you're going to claim 80% from the government. You then have to fund the difference between the 80 and the 20%, so from the 80 to 100. All right, so very quickly, I'm just conscious of time and I know that I can see some questions coming through. So we can move on to the next slide. I'm going to talk about salary and what salary actually includes, because again, there's been a lot in the press about this. So salary includes wages, past overtime, fees, compulsory commission payments. So if you have employees who are on target earnings employees, so they earn the vast majority of their salary via compulsory commission schemes, they would be eligible. On the legal side, the legal wording actually says anything that arises from a legally enforceable agreement. So for example, if you have employees with a car allowance, that should also be covered under the salary bucket. And what you're going to do is you're going to look at all of these elements to define what your reference salary is to help you calculate the pay moving forward. Things that you cannot include though are discretionary bonuses, which would include tips. So individuals who are on tronic type arrangements are excluded. Commission payments, non-cash payments, effectively any payments that are dependent on the performance of the company, and any payments that are payable at the discretion of the employer or another person, which is how they've got now down to gratuities, because that's dependent on another individual. So 2 buckets. What can you include? What can you exclude? Anything that is considered compulsory, you include. Anything that's considered discretionary, you exclude. Overtime generally would fit into include if it has been consistent or if it is compulsory under the contract. If somebody's been claiming overtime for a consistent period of time, so 6, 12 months, then you would agree to include it, particularly if your holiday calculation includes overtime. So if we could just move on, the salary reference point that you need to look at, so how are you going to start calculating the salary for annual staff, so for people on an annual salary, and they're defining an annual salary effectively as somebody who receives equal payment throughout the year. So somebody who might be on 30 grand a year over, and they're on 12-month payrolls. So it is divided by the amount of pay periods. You look at the salary that the individual was paid in the last pay period prior to the 19th of March. We have lovely HMRC to thank for confusing us all. So most people, if you're a month-end payer, you're just going to look at the salary that you paid your employees at the end of February, and you'll use that as your reference point. And there is an unless. So if you've already completed your calculation for your first claim and you based it on salaries on the 28th of February, that is fine for your first claim. Now, really, this is only going to impact organisations who pay people on a more frequent basis, or if your pay period was in between the 28th of Feb and the 19th of March. The scope of that, the amount of people is probably a little bit smaller, but just be aware that your second claim cannot be based on the 28th of February. It needs to be based on the one just prior to the 19th of March. Told you HMRC are confusing this as we go along. A couple of very quick examples. So if we could have the next slide, please, David. So everybody would have probably seen by now that this is a scheme to cover 80% of the reference salary. So the reference salary is what we've just worked out, and you're going to cap it at £2,500. So a couple of examples at the bottom. So for example, somebody's salary on the 28th of Feb was £3 grand for the month. You work out 80%, which is 2,400. The cap is 2,500. The furlough pay then becomes 2,400. This is the amount of money, rather than 3,000, the individual's salary has been reduced to 2,400, and that is what you're going to put through payroll. That amount of money is then subject to usual payroll deductions for the employee, so PAYE, national insurance, and if they have anything else that comes out of it. For you as the employer, you're going to claim that £2,400 and you're going to add on to it your employer's national insurance contribution and the minimum automatic pensions enrolment of 3%. So example number 2 just takes it the other way. So we're suggesting a salary of £4,000 in the month. You follow the calculation through. On this example, actually the cap is the lower of the two. So 80% of 4,000 is 3,200. So unfortunately the individual's furlough pay becomes 2,500 because that's where the cap kicks in. Variable pay is a little bit more complicated, and David, I'm not sure, do participants get these slides at the end?
Yes, we can offer them to them if they would like them. So that one seems to be not coming. Oh, here we are. Just a quick, yes, we can certainly send them. I do have one quick question. Before there, when you said the holiday pay gets topped up, if it's the latter example where it's a larger amount and the difference is not 20%, are they required to top it up to the full salary for that period?
Yes, absolutely. So it would go out back to exactly what the individual's pay should have been for that day. So yes, for higher salary earners where the cap is more problematic, you would go back to their original salary.
Great, thank you for clarifying that.
So salary reference point for variable pay, this is a little bit more complicated, so it might be worthwhile. I will go through this quite quickly, but if you've got access to the slides afterwards, we've just documented it for you. So 3 particular elements. It will depend on how you calculate the reference salary, will depend on their length of service. So there's 3 things that you need to look at, whether they've been there for 12 months, less than 12 months, or if they were a February starter. The example that I've got is for more than 12 months service. So what you would do is you would look at the average pay for the tax year 2019-2020, and you compare it to the same month last year that you are paying this year. So if we could move on to the next slide, David, I've just set out 3 months worth of data here, and because it's out there, perfect. So what we'd look at, if we look at the top box, if you pull your data or get your payroll provider to pull your data, the first thing you need to know is what the average monthly pay for 2019-2020 was. In this example, it was £1,800. And then you can see on the March, April, May 2019, we've also pulled out those figures. So March, they earned 2,600, April, it's 1,400, and May, 2,000. So I'm just going to pick on April as the example. So the first thing you do is you actually compare April 2019 to the average. So it's 1,400 versus 1,800. And the first thing you do is you take the higher of the 2 amounts. So you take the 1,800. You then compare that to the cap. The cap is 2,500. So we now know that you then take the lower of the cap and the 1,800, which becomes quite confusing. So 1,800 becomes the furlough pay. So I'm not going to go through all of those examples because the more you talk through some of these examples, they become a little bit more complicated, but they are there laid out for you. The guidance online does also set it out. It is a bit cumbersome to walk through, but hopefully it's quite clear that you are just looking at different reference points. So you take the higher of either the monthly pay or the pay in the month that you're processing last year. Take that, then compare it to the cap, and then if it's the lower of the 2. So we're going to move on to the next slide. We can now look at how and what you're actually going to claim. And as this comes up, so you're going to be claiming the furlough pay. So this is the 80% capped at £2,500. As I mentioned, you're also going to claim on top of that employers' national insurance contributions, and you'll claim pensions as well. The portal opened yesterday, and by all accounts, it's actually been working quite seamlessly. The HMRC have confirmed that they've got capacity in the system to be processing 450,000 claims per hour. And yesterday they reported they had around about 147,000 companies claim. Now, you'd be claiming one claim per pay period, but what you can do is you can combine the claims. Now, what they mean by this is they want to be able to see that your claim is timed back to your payroll data and your RTI. And so, for example, if you are at the moment you're thinking of claiming for March and April, you create two claims. So you'd have one for your March payroll, one for your April payroll. But then when you're submitting it, you would just submit one gross figure per employee. You can claim up to 14 days in advance of payroll. So particularly for organisations who've got bad cash flow at the moment, you can actually go and get the money in advance of your payroll being processed. You must also then, all the money that you receive from the grant does get processed onto the employee. If you have different pay periods for different groups of people in your organisation, so for example, you might have some who are weekly paid and some who are monthly paid, you would create claims based on those pay periods. So for your weekly paid people, you're going to submit your claims on a week-by-week basis. For your monthly people, you're going to claim on a month-by-month basis. You don't combine the crossover on payrolls. Okay? So what have we got next? So the final thing just to look at, all the information that you need about how and where to claim is on the government website. You'll click on a link that will take you into the portal. You do need quite a lot of information that's documented, and you're all free to go and get my bite-sized downloads that are free on my website that stipulates out all of the information that you are required to have in front of you. If you are submitting claims for less than 100 people, you're going to have to manually enter all of the data that is required. That includes things like names, payroll numbers, and NI numbers. And if you're submitting claims for over 100 people, you can do it by a file upload. So you just create an Excel file and submit the data that way. So the last thing just to touch on before we open up for questions is on rehiring employees. So if we could move forward, please, David. So obviously there's been a lot of noise about this cutoff, and can you take employees back who aren't eligible to join the furlough program with their new employer because they've missed cutoffs? Ultimately, you can take workers back who have left. Obviously, that is your choice as the employer. The guidelines talks about being made redundant or stop working on or after the 28th of February. So they need to have been on an RTI submission on or before the 28th of February to enable them to come back. Now the challenge, and it's the challenge that anybody should always highlight, is there is no clarity on what that actually means about the impact on the employment relationship. Now, as you know, when you employ people, they automatically start accruing statutory rights, things like annual leave, the right of notice, etc., and protection from dismissal. Now, the question is, if you're going to bring somebody back for the purposes of furlough, does their continuity of employment continue? There is no law at the moment, so it is an area to be very, very cautious of. You can bring people back on a very specific, what we're calling a furlough agreement, and they are available out there in the big wide world, or if you get in contact with me, we can send you a furlough agreement. The problem with a furlough agreement is because this is brand new law, we don't know how they are going to stack up. And any lawyer that suggests that we do know how they're going to stack up, we don't, because they haven't been tested in a court. The only thing that we can do is protect businesses a bit better by having a specific written agreement in place so that the employee knows the terms upon which they are coming back. You still might have to pay out annual leave when they go, or you still might have to formally terminate their employment in accordance with employment law. So for example, if by coming back they start going over the 2-year mark, you then might have to actually make them redundant. We're hoping that this position might be clarified. It hasn't yet, but as we've seen over the last 4 weeks, the scheme's been updated 5 times. So we're hoping that one of the next updates might actually include what to do from an employment relationship. So unfortunately, that is kind of up in the ether. That kind of brings me to the end of what I was going to talk about. Appreciate there's lots of questions flying through. So over to David to field some questions.
Great, Tom, thank you very much for that. That was very helpful. It certainly sounds like it is quite a complicated system.
Yeah, it's HMRC, so it's going to be complicated.
Let's start with some of the questions. Computer to cooperate. There we are. So I know there was a question that I just saw. Maybe we can touch on this quickly about this variable pay. So it seemed the question was in that example, the April example, where they were only getting 1,800 for April, and you take the higher of the average annual pay versus the furlough amount. So there you're paying them more than that month. So ostensibly you're sort of paying them more, or sort of.
So what you're doing is so let's take April as an example. So you're submitting your claim for April 2020. So the thing you do is you look back at April 2019 and look at how much they were paid in April 2019 and just write that number down. The bit that you're then comparing it to is what their average salary was for tax year 2019-2020. You then write that number down next to it. First thing you do is you take the higher of those two numbers. So say, for example, the higher number comes out to be £2,000 for that month. That is then what you're then going to start putting through the calculation process. So is that £2,000 within the cap? Yes, it is. So that becomes then the reference salary that you're then going to times by 80% to get back to the furlough salary. So it's all kind of, it's just taking it through kind of the pipe of how you get from a reference salary to your furlough salary. And from reference to furlough, that's where you're doing the calculation of 80% or the 2,500 cap.
Great. Okay. Thanks for that. So let's start tackling some of these questions if you don't mind. So we've got a question here from John saying the online calculator is not working out as 80% of salaries. It's counting days of the weekends and dividing accordingly. Surely 80% of 1,000 is 800. The calculator calculated as such, so it's very confusing. When the payroll was run before the portal was available, if set salaries, should we stick to 80% of salaried amount?
So the difficulty is, and for some reason, and we don't know why because we're not HMRC, HMRC have decided to use calendar days rather than what a standard employer would use is 260 working days in the year. Now, again, this could be subject to a little bit of a challenge. It's only really going to make a difference if you're trying to claim by days, because they've also set out what the maximum claims per week and per month are. And they've done the week and the per month as you would expect. So 2,500 is the maximum per month. And then to get to the week, they've effectively times that by 12 divided by 52 to get your weekly amount. The difficulty is with days, and this is where your claim amounts might not quite match up if you've personally calculated it versus then using the online calculator, because you've got some months that have got 30 days and some months that have got 31 days. So the advice at the moment is to follow that calculator online, because you don't want a claim to automatically rejected because you're going over a limit, but also then to work out what the difference between the two is, so that as things get clarified, you're going to know that actually I should be submitting a claim for an extra £100, whatever it is. For big employers, obviously these numbers get a lot bigger. But that is the calculation that HMRC have put out. Or what we're doing at the moment is we're following what they're saying. I believe the calculator, because I think there are actually two, there's one in the portal itself and there's one before you get to the portal. I believe they were actually both taken down offline last night. So it might be worthwhile, if you have got the luxury of time and you don't need to submit a claim to get the money in ready for April payroll, I personally would just maybe give the system a couple of days, because this is typically where things start to iron themselves out. If you need to make this claim now, you're going to have to base it on the HMRC calculator, which does go into days, weeks and months. And there is an example there. And also, I think a lot of organisations are starting to create calculators that they can share publicly. Yes, it is confusing, but you're going to have to go with that calendar view rather than a 260 days view.
Okay, thank you for that. We have another question here from Tom asking if you can clarify what the boundaries are for email communications for furloughed employees.
So I think what you can do is you can keep in contact with your employees, absolutely. While people are furloughed, they can undertake training. So if you have access to things like e-learning, or people can do training on site, again, if it is safe for people to come in to undertake training. What you can't do is they can't do things that would be considered work. So if it is part of their day job, whether that's communicating with a supplier or coordinating things, that is effectively work. The only way around it is for you to create an argument by the activity that you're asking them to undertake is not work. So it's not providing a service or generating revenue. If you can create that argument, then that's what you would need to present to HMRC when they come asking. Okay.
Thank you. We have another question here from Nomana saying that an HR consultant informed them that it was mandatory to write to the furloughed employee every 3 weeks to confirm they are still furloughed, and that was mentioned on an HMRC webinar. Is that correct?
No, that wasn't mentioned on an HMRC webinar either. Unfortunately, there's a lot of confusion about this. So it's going to depend on what you have already said to your employees. If you have sent out a letter and had it confirmed back from the employee that basically says you are furloughed until further notice, then that's fine. And then obviously within the letter, you'll tell people how you're going to keep in communication with them. If you have sent out a letter that says you are furloughed until date X, and that happens to be 3 weeks later, yes, you are going to have to. The original guidance, when it came out, there was a lot of misunderstanding about this terminology around a 3-week minimum. So it is a 3-week minimum, but a lot of people, unfortunately, lawyers, HR consultants, a lot of people interpreted it as that furlough had to be taken in 3-week blocks. So you could only be on furlough for 3, 6, 9, 12 weeks. That's not the case. It's a minimum of 3 weeks. So it's going to depend on what you've already done. If you send something out to say you are going to be furloughed until date X, yes, update that letter. My advice would be then to make it have no end date in it. Say that we will be in regular communication, but you are furloughed until further notice. That's the way that I would handle that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom. We have another question here from John. I'm afraid, John, it's not clear, your question to me, I'm afraid. The payday,
because it might be this weird language of that. So, you know.
My payday was 24, and then 2/5 paid work, 3/5 furlough. How would you process this, and how do you calculate the ER/NI amount and pension for the furlough? Do those dates make sense to you, or should we ask for clarification on that?
No, if we could clarify, I think I'm probably about 80% there, but yeah, I'd rather answer the question knowing what the question is rather than.
Those dates are slightly confusing, John. If you could maybe clarify that for us, that would be helpful. Is it okay for furloughed employees to continue to join weekly update calls so they're kept informed and ready when they return to work?
Yeah, I think so. Ultimately, you need to put in place an engagement plan with your employees because you want them to still feel as though they are connected to the organisation. Again, as long as they're not working, then it's absolutely fine. And as long as it's not mandatory, unfortunately, you can't mandate individuals joining an update call. But you can, you can make it part of your overall employee engagement process, that it would be worthwhile and it's worth their benefit actually hearing from the company every once in a while. Okay,
thank you. We have another question here from Michelle asking, if I give my workers 5 days notice to take 5 days holiday, I just have to pay the top up 20% and still claim the 80% furlough.
So no, because the first thing is you actually have to give double the amount of notice for the amount of days you want your employees to take as annual leave. So if you want them to take 5 consecutive days, you have to give 10 consecutive days notice. So it's a 2-for-1. If you've done that, yes, you can. You can confirm to your employees that you want them to take annual leave. And a lot of employers are doing that. I think what I'm hearing is a lot of employers are ultimately asking them to at least take what they're going to accrue while they are on furlough. You then, you process everything in the same way, but you need to make sure that that employee is paid their regular wage, and then you would claim the furlough amount rather than the regular wage.
Okay, great, thank you. We have another question from John Gilmore. An employee not on the shielding list, but with a valid immune health concern, decided to take unpaid leave for April. Can this employee be furloughed?
Well, it depends if they are actually shielding or not. And you know, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical professional, and if you're not a medical professional, don't give medical advice. If there is a genuine concern that they sit in that high vulnerability category and should be shielded, ask them to go and get confirmation from their GP. You are absolutely entitled to do that. And it's not about not trusting your employees, it's about making sure you've got the evidence to support your claim to HMRC. So, and again, that's a bit of a misunderstanding, because I think some employees are thinking, my employer doesn't trust me. No, it's not that. Your employee does trust you. None of us trust HMRC, which sounds a bit harsh. So you need that documentation just in case somebody asks you, because HMRC can say, well, where is your proof that this individual needed to be shielded? If they aren't in the category who need to shield, then you have to come up with other options. Now, if you want to continue paying them, that's your business. That's down to you. If you want to put them on sick leave, again, they could go into company sick pay or SSP if they are self-isolating, because if they're not shielding, they'll be classed as self-isolating.
Great, thank you. We have a question here from Julie about local governments. Local government is stating that the furlough scheme isn't applicable to them. For someone who has left the county council to go self-employed within the time frame, they've been told that they're unable to apply for furlough. Therefore, there would be no income for that person. Is there any guidance you can offer there?
Yeah, so the reason why public authorities are saying that the furlough doesn't apply is because public employees get paid by the government anyway. So if you think commercial organisations don't, and this is a way for commercial organisations to have the government pay wages. What the public authorities who I've spoken to, particularly in-house council within public services, if people are effectively furloughed, as in there is no work for them, they're just asking them to remain at home on leave paid. So you could go back to the public authority and talk to them about that. It's probably unlikely that they would do that, if I'm truly honest, because there still has to be this requirement that no work is available. If there's no work available, then the organisation can follow the same process. All the public authority won't do is they're not going to claim that 80% from the government, because they're already getting paid your wages from the government. So it's just robbing Peter to pay Paul. That's why public authorities are saying that they can't take part in it. They can follow the same process, they're just not claiming.
Great, thank you. We have another question here from Namana asking, in connection to training, does the employer have to pay extra to take training?
No, the only requirement is on the days that an individual is training. If the furlough pay has taken the employee below national minimum wage, you have to ensure the individual is receiving at least you have to ensure that the individual is receiving national minimum wage, because it is counted as a pseudo work day. It is a day where national minimum wage does apply, whereas NMW doesn't apply when the individual is furloughed because they are not working. Any other employee who's already being paid above national minimum wage and their furlough amount is above, no, you don't have to offer them any extra compensation.
Great, thanks, Tom. Azam is asking what sort of work a trainee solicitor can do while furloughed.
It really kind of depends. If you're furloughed, you can carry on doing your training, but ultimately you can't do anything that means that the work that you do means that, or the training that you do means that your employer could then have that as billable hours back to your clients. So you can continue training, but you can't provide services or you can't generate revenue. Great,
thank you. So we did get a clarification on that question from John, who was saying that his pay date was on the 20th of April. 2/5 was paid as hours they had actually worked before furlough. 3/5 was time furloughed. How would you process this, and how do you calculate the ERNI amount and pension for the furlough?
So that's going probably into a little bit of too much technical detail for a webinar. I'm happy if you want to contact me via the website. I can probably actually look into it a little bit better for you. My website is blakeconnolly.co.uk. We have a hello@blakeconnolly.co.uk email address. But yeah, I need to actually sit and write things down to look at that rather than just it being a standard webinar question.
Of course. And I will repeat those details at the end, because I'm sure a lot of people have more technical questions, and we'll
I'm sure we do.
navigating this potentially quite Byzantine HMRC system. Now, we have a couple more questions. Tom, I don't know how much time you have. We've already taken an hour of your time almost, so should we try and do it?
I'm good to keep going. I've probably got about another 10, 20 minutes.
Okay, great. So let's just see if we can tackle a few more.
Sure.
I'm a nursery manager, and the furlough situation seems to have become more complicated suddenly. I'm wondering if you have any tips for private nurseries that have part government funding.
Unfortunately, yes, the situation has become a lot more complicated. I think that, again, the guidance was updated again on Friday. I think, again, it's probably one to take offline because it is quite technical, because it involves actually looking at how you might split revenue streams and how revenue is going to come in. So again, if you want to email me via the website, I'm more than happy to answer individual queries. The way that my free advice works is that I'm quite happy to spend kind of maybe 5-10 minutes on a query. Anything after that starts becoming billable. Which
seems very fair, and obviously very kind of you to have taken so much time this morning to help people address some of these questions as well. Sorry, someone seems to be hammering. They're working from home. So we have a question from Monica asking, the government's paying up to 80% of salary. Do we need to submit the confirmation that the payment was made with the online application, bank statements, etc.?
No, you don't. Ultimately, they'll do that via audit at the back end of the process. And the way the portal actually works, all you're actually doing is submitting a claim for an amount of money. So they are expecting you to have calculated it. They are expecting you to have documented it by employee. And then they'll probably expect you to be keeping hold of bank statements to make sure that they can see the flow of cash. It's just worthwhile having all of these things to hand, documented as well at the time that you made the decisions that you made, particularly with government advice that's changed 5 times in 4 weeks. If you've got something pinpointed that tells HMRC the reason why you made a decision based on this piece of information, document that now. Because if you're going to try and do that in 4 years' time with hindsight, when we're all sitting there going, well, of course, this is what we should have been doing, that's very, very different to making in-the-moment decisions for businesses. So while it always feels a bit of a challenge for a business to start documenting things right there and then, because there's always other things to do, I can guarantee if you do that now, it's going to pay you dividends in the time to come when you're going to get audited.
Excellent. This question from Denise, I think you've already answered. The 2.5 is taxable for employees. It's that amount.
Yeah.
John is asking if employees accrue holiday pay while they're on furlough.
Yes, they do. So while you're on furlough, you accrue all of your statutory rights, which includes annual leave. Now, the statutory element of annual leave absolutely automatically is accrued. Whether or not they're going to accrue, if you enhance that, if you are going to allow them to continue to accrue that, is a decision for the business to make. As it's in your contract, it will automatically accrue, but obviously you could try and vary that by a variation of contract. I'm telling you that because that is something that you can do. I wouldn't advocate for it. I would just say that there is that option if you want to, because the difference is typically only 5 days. So I would still allow employees to be accruing at their full rate on just the statutory rate.
Okay. Thanks, Tom. We've got a question here from Steve saying he did make his first claim last night and the system told him to do a combined claim. He could not submit separate claims for monthly and weekly payroll. So
that's interesting. That's new news. It's the first time I've heard that coming through. Well, if that's all the system is telling you, again, I wonder if it's not quite how they've positioned it. So I'm wondering if the system and the positioning statements aren't quite tying up 100%. I think ultimately, as long as what you've got in the background is something that goes, well, this file shows me how I've made my monthly pay, and this file shows me how I've done the weekly pay. Again, when you're audited, you've got all of that information really quite clear. Now, if any of you have ever been audited by HMRC, I have. The clearer you can make something, the quicker they go away. if something is a bit opaque and you're not quite sure how you've done something, the longer they're going to stay with you and the longer they're going to be on your back. So if you've got, for example, those two files and then the system's just saying, we'll just do a combined claim, well, then fine, just do a combined claim over that whole pay period. But then at least, you know, you've got the backing data that tells HMRC eventually, this is how I came to the decision that I did.
Okay, great. I think we're getting close to the end here. We have one question, which I think someone's confused about the calculating the pension contribution. So what would they do in that instance? Could that be more complicated and they would need to email you?
No, so it's actually quite straightforward. So your pension contribution calculation doesn't change. The best way to think about this is that the only thing that has changed is the gross amount of pay that you're pushing through your payroll. If your pension contribution is higher than the standard or higher than the minimum, you're going to reduce it. So you take off the lower earnings limit, which is about £517 off the top of my head, and then it's 3%. So it's 3% of that salary minus the lower earnings limit equals what you can claim for. So nothing really is changing apart from kind of, if you think about it as a process starting at the top and ending at the bottom, it's just this one number at the top that's changed. Everything else runs through the calculation process in the same way.
Great, thank you. Okay, Steve, you're asking here, couldn't get the calculator to work. Okay, so it sounds like there's this question of days versus weeks is tripping people up and making the system a bit tricky. So
yeah. And don't forget, the HMRC have only really put the calculation guidance out for the last couple of days. I think as employers, advisors, as well as employers, we're all trying to get our heads around it at the same time. If there is a genuine, it's not connecting properly, you can very, very much guarantee that the noise will start to come up. I personally haven't even had the time yet to actually get into looking at the calculation v what the guidance says. You can as soon as we all start realizing that it's not quite right, you can guarantee that we'll all start shouting at HMRC to get it clarified. Okay. So maybe give it a day. As I say, if you've got the luxury of being able to wait maybe a day or two, then do. I appreciate not all businesses do, because this is a real cash flow issue. If you have to do it kind of now, you're going to have to follow their calculation guide. Okay,
thanks, Tom. We have one last question here. There was conflicting information around getting a signed agreement from furloughed employees last week. Were you able to find out if getting a signed agreement was a mandatory part of the HMRC audit?
So I think it will be. The original guidance did say that you needed to confirm in writing. Now the updated guidance, and even on the HMRC schedule, so the bit that's online that says employers, this is how you can claim, in there it is even confused, because there is one paragraph that says you do need written consent, and then there is another paragraph that says that you do not need written consent. So what I personally look at is, I'm kind of going, well, forget that, because there is actually now a piece of law. Under the Coronavirus Act, there is a schedule that talks that there is the job retention scheme, and it is documented in there that you need written consent. The other thing that has happened that also strengthens this, which is why I think HMRC are being a little bit woolly about it, is Carluccio's, the restaurant chain, went into administration. Now there's already been a hearing. Because of insolvency laws, there are 14 days by which the administrators needed to take some action, and they actually went and sought clarification from the High Court about how furlough works. In that judgment, the judge has said, if you don't have written consent, you cannot assume that your employee has agreed to be furloughed. And the key word that has always been used is agreed. So I would, 4,000 braces. Now you could say to HMRC, we did this based on the guidance that you set out at the time. So we think we've done everything right. my counsel to any employer is to spend the hour or 2 hours that it might take you just sending out a new confirmation and asking people to sign it. And the easiest way to do that is to say to your employees, look, we haven't changed anything. HMRC have changed what they want from us as an employer. Please just give us your consent in any which way you can. Now, that doesn't need to be a physical signature. It could just be an email. If you have got a good relationship with your employees anyway, this shouldn't be difficult to achieve. It's only going to be with the ones who have always been difficult, and all employers know who their difficult employees are. So you might need to try it in a slightly different way. But I would, now that the legislation's come in, again, HMRC, they're not going to audit you now. They're going to audit you in a year or 2 years' time, and they guarantee it will be saying, well, it is in legislation that you need a written agreement. They will forget that 3 weeks beforehand they said that you didn't need written agreement. So I would just do it.
Okay, great. Do we have time for one last question?
Yeah, shoot.
Tom Bailey's asking here, we have employees that are better off on furlough than at work because overtime is not available at the moment. And I'm wondering if you can rotate staff.
Yes, you can. As long as the minimum amount of time that each individual is on furlough is for 3 weeks. And actually, that's what a lot of employers are actually doing, is they'll kind of, they'll segregate their workforce into like Group A and Group B. Group A go for the first 3 weeks, Group A comes back, Group B goes on furlough, and that rotation just continues. As long as the period of furlough is for 3 weeks, so Group A go for 3 weeks, they come back. Group B go for 3 weeks, then Group A go again for 3 weeks, because that is considered a new period of furlough. So each new period of furlough has to be for a minimum of 3 weeks. But that's actually quite a good way as well, actually, to keep your workforce engaged, to bring them back into the workplace so they actually feel connected. And also just means people benefit in slightly different ways. So I think it is a good thing to do.
Great. Tom, that's incredibly kind. You've been very generous with your time this morning, and it's been incredibly informative. So I want to give one question I had for you is, so are you happy for me to share the presentation with the attendees today? Great. So I will send out a copy of this presentation to everyone after the webinar is over, and there will be an automatic replay that is available immediately after the presentation ends. So I want to give people the opportunity to get in touch with you. So you said that the website is www.blakeconnolly.co.uk?
That's right. It's in the presentation as well, because sometimes people get Connolly spelt wrong, which is fine.
Connolly.
That's right. Yeah.
.co.uk.
Yeah. Or as well, if you are on Twitter, you can follow me on Twitter. I am @thehrguy_. You can effectively see me shouting HMRC quite a few times a day. To get things clarified, which works. bizarrely enough, I've actually got them to clarify a couple of things. The way I work is I will quite happily, if it's a query that takes maybe 5 or 10 minutes, you can have that free of charge. You don't get covered by my liability insurance though, because you're not a fee-paying client. If you want to be a fee-paying client, more than happy to have a conversation to set up a file for anybody, and then obviously you would be covered by liability insurance.
Excellent. Well, I hope that that everyone found that informative. I know that I did. I'm sure everyone did, because it was a lot of great comments coming through here. It was an incredibly helpful session. So we are very appreciative of your time this morning, Tom. It's been a pleasure having you on.
Thank you so much.
And yeah, good luck, everybody, and stay safe.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Take care.
Bye-bye.